So Princess Charlotte just got a terrifyingly significant new title, and the precise manner in which it happened tells you absolutely everything about where the British royal family is actually headed in the modern era. The palace confirmed the major structural decision exactly 3 minutes ago, but the historic announcement itself almost did not happen because someone highly influential inside the royal household tried desperately to delay the whole thing until after the next grand royal ceremony. Prince William completely refused to accept any delays, and honestly, the fact that there was such heavy internal resistance at all is the exact part of the story that does not get nearly enough attention from the mainstream media. Charlotte did not smile even for a single second when the official constitutional words were spoken in the private room. She sat quietly beside Catherine, gripping the edge of her wooden chair tightly as pride, fear, and deep confusion crossed her young face in rapid succession. The palace administration had officially named her the Royal Guardian of the Crown, a brand new institutional role meaning she would formally become George's principal royal support, lead major charitable duties, and directly represent him during national emergencies. William watched his daughter absorb every single word carefully. The prince knew the updated succession plan and the long-term blueprint deciding how duties and authority would pass to the next generation did not threaten George's place as the direct heir. His eldest son remained first in line to inherit the historic throne. Yet the future king understood the massive emotional cost of this heavy decision. By protecting George from total isolation, he had placed a profound burden on Charlotte that no royal daughter of her generation had carried so openly before the public. A senior palace aide moved the sealed leather plan across the large table. William opened it slowly, reached the final paragraph, then read those specific lines twice to be absolutely certain. The clause gave Charlotte much more than a simple ceremonial label. It allowed her to receive advanced constitutional training, attend selected high-level briefings, and step forward as George's official deputy during a national crisis. Catherine turned toward her husband, searching his expression because she deeply understood why those exact words mattered so much. The title could give their daughter a profound sense of purpose, but it could also permanently take away the innocent freedom of being young. William signed the approval and set the heavy pen down. Then he turned directly toward Charlotte. "This title is not about standing behind George," he said firmly, "it is about standing beside him." She looked toward Catherine before meeting her father's eyes, and the heavy silence carried far more weight than any royal applause ever could. The announcement had been released much earlier than originally planned because resistance had formed deep inside the household, and someone had tried to delay confirmation until after the next royal ceremony. William refused because he knew delay would invite unwanted outside interference, weaken Charlotte's official position, and turn a private family decision into a bitter palace struggle. Congratulations began arriving from various departments, but one senior royal offered absolutely nothing. No message, no phone call, no public word of support. William noticed the absence immediately. But before the palace could celebrate Charlotte's new position, William had to face the relatives who understood that her historic rise would quietly rearrange their own futures. Behind the polished palace statement stood a real family facing an impossible emotional balance. George remained the future king, yet Charlotte had suddenly been given a historic title carrying real authority, heavy duty, and immense public expectation. William saw strength in his daughter, Catherine saw the hidden dangers that strength could attract, and George, still young enough to need his sister but old enough to understand succession, was forced to consider whether the person closest to him had just become part of the machinery surrounding his future. William had watched Charlotte for years. She noticed emotional tension before others spoke, protected Louis without being asked, and understood exactly when George needed silent support rather than advice. Those unique qualities convinced the prince that she could become his son's strongest ally. The new succession structure, the plan deciding how royal duties would be prepared and shared, was meant to stop loyalty from turning into rivalry. Catherine understood the danger immediately. The princess supported giving her daughter a clear purpose, but she refused to let the title swallow Charlotte's childhood. Royal children were often praised for strength, while quietly losing the freedom to make ordinary mistakes. She feared the palace would begin treating the young siblings as symbols before they had learned who they truly were outside of duty. George heard the truth before the announcement reached the public. William explained that his position as heir had not changed, but Charlotte would now receive training beside him. The boy listened, then looked directly at his sister. "Does this mean you always have to follow me?" he asked. Charlotte did not answer quickly. Catherine watched her daughter think while William remained silent. Then the young princess shook her head. "I don't want your crown," she said. "I just don't want you to face it alone." George lowered his eyes, visibly relieved, but his mother turned away for a moment, unable to hide what those words had done to her. William then admitted the deeper reason behind the title. He wanted to prevent the painful spare dynamic, a destructive pattern in which the child behind the heir grows up defined by distance from the throne rather than by a purpose of their own. Charlotte would not be pushed into the shadows or forced to compete for relevance. Catherine soon learned that several senior advisors had proposed separating the children's future training entirely. George would have received strict constitutional preparation while Charlotte followed a more limited public path. William rejected the proposal and rewrote the plan himself. He believed separation would weaken both children and repeat old family wounds. George finally crossed the room and offered Charlotte his hand. She took it. William looked toward Catherine, and she met his eyes with equal parts relief and fear. That quiet gesture between brother and sister carried more meaning than the palace announcement because it followed a ceremony where the family's hidden fears had first erupted into the open. The decision did not begin inside a committee room. It began during a royal ceremony 6 months earlier, when one unexpected absence left Prince George exposed before hundreds of guests. As confusion spread behind closed doors, Charlotte stepped forward without instruction, calmed her younger brother, and quietly helped George complete a responsibility that senior courtiers feared would collapse. William watched every second. By the end of that afternoon, he understood that the monarchy had already revealed Charlotte's role before anyone had officially named it. George had been scheduled to deliver his first formal address during the Commonwealth Youth Service at St. George's Hall. The service was a major royal gathering designed to celebrate young people across Commonwealth nations. William was meant to stand beside his son while Charlotte and Louis remained close enough to support him. Without sharing the central duty, everything changed minutes before George was called forward. Charles suffered a sudden spell of exhaustion, and William was taken aside to receive an urgent medical update. The program could not be delayed for long. Guests were waiting, officials were whispering, and the boy who had prepared for weeks suddenly realized his father would not be beside him. George froze near the entrance. His hands trembled, and his breathing became shallow. Charlotte noticed before any courtier moved. Catherine tried to reach them, but officials rearranging the order blocked her path for several tense seconds. The princess watched helplessly as her daughter stepped closer to George and lowered her voice. "You only have to take the first step," Charlotte told him. George looked at her, then toward the doorway. She walked beside him until the final moment and remained close enough for him to find her whenever fear returned. The address continued, the ceremony survived, and what senior officials had expected to collapse was held together by a child who had never been assigned that responsibility. William returned before the end and understood immediately what had happened. He watched George complete the address, but his attention kept returning to Charlotte. Her calm had protected her brother without stealing his moment. That balance mattered because the future king would need loyalty without rivalry, and she had shown both instinctively. Later, William requested the original succession support framework, the private plan outlining how the heir and his siblings would be prepared for future duties. He discovered Charlotte had no clear path, no structured training, and no protection from being pushed into the shadows or exposed without preparation. After the ceremony, William knelt beside her and asked why she had stepped forward. "Because George looked alone," Charlotte replied. The prince rose slowly, changed by the answer. William left that corridor knowing what he intended to do. But the moment he placed Charlotte's future before the family, one confrontation threatened to destroy the plan entirely. The succession plan might have remained a quiet, deeply protected family arrangement had Queen Camilla not suddenly challenged its most powerful and transformative clause. Behind the securely closed doors of a private palace sitting room, she directly warned William that Charlotte's unprecedented new position could create severe internal confusion, dramatically weaken established senior royal roles, and provoke intense public comparisons that the modern monarchy was simply not prepared to manage. William did not raise his voice even a single decibel during this unexpected confrontation. He did something far more decisive and historically telling. He firmly closed the leather folder, looked directly across the polished table, and made it absolutely clear that his young daughter's constitutional future was no longer open for internal negotiation or political compromise. Camilla pushed the heavy succession folder back toward him with a look of stern disapproval. The document was the highly confidential, formal plan defining exactly how future royal duties would pass to George's generation and precisely how Charlotte would step up to support him as a primary pillar of the crown. She argued passionately that creating a completely new title outside the familiar centuries-old structure could appear to publicly bypass Princess and Prince Edward and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. All of them were highly experienced, deeply dedicated working royals who had spent decades carrying heavy constitutional duties for King Charles and Queen Elizabeth. William kept one strong hand firmly placed on the folder, refusing to back down. The prince answered calmly that Charlotte's assigned role was not a negative judgment on anyone currently serving the king. It was designed out of absolute necessity for the long-term survival of the monarchy itself. George would eventually inherit a significantly smaller institution that could not afford to leave the future heir completely isolated, nor could it leave his highly capable sister without a clear, legally defined institutional purpose. Camilla's voice softened slightly, but the political tension in the room only sharpened. She asked whether Charlotte was truly old enough to carry such a massive weight of public expectation and duty. William heard genuine family concern in her voice, yet he also clearly sensed something else beneath the surface. It was the deep-rooted instinct to protect an existing palace hierarchy that his modern plan would quietly yet permanently reshape. Then the queen consort crossed a sensitive line. She subtly suggested that Catherine's strong personal influence had made the proposal far too personal, turning a major constitutional decision into a mother's strategic attempt to artificially elevate her own daughter above others. William's expression changed instantly into a mask of cold determination. He strictly warned Camilla never to reduce Charlotte's inherent, proven ability to Catherine's alleged ambition. His wife had actually argued for extreme caution, not power, and he would not allow her natural maternal restraint to be twisted into political manipulation by palace courtiers. Camilla then revealed much more than she originally intended to share during the private conversation. She admitted that several senior advisors had already approached Charles behind William's back, asking the king to officially delay the title until George reached full adulthood. William realized immediately that the internal resistance was not limited to this single room. It had spread secretly through the palace corridors before anyone had been honest enough to tell him directly. The new title would completely change the temperature of the family, Camilla said, pushing the folder forward once again as a final warning. William slid it back toward himself without a trace of hesitation. The family has already changed, the prince replied flatly. The plan simply admits the reality of what we face. The prince then disclosed a massive secret that ended the debate. King Charles had privately approved the principal clauses months earlier during a private meeting. The only authority left to finalize the document was William's own consent as Charlotte's father and the future sovereign of the realm. Camilla fell completely silent, realizing the battle was already lost. William stood up, took the heavy document, and left the room immediately. Moments later, the queen consort urgently requested a private meeting with Charles, fully convinced that the king could still soften, amend, or completely suspend the radical decision before it reached the public. The intense confrontation ended with William holding the official document, but the final balance of power still rested with the one man whose historic signature could turn a private family decision into lasting royal history. King Charles understood deeply that Charlotte's new title was about far more than the future of one individual child. Approving it officially meant accepting William's long-term vision of a modernized monarchy before his own reign had even reached its final chapter. Rejecting it, however, could permanently fracture the future king's confidence and leave George without the essential support structure his father believed was critical for his survival. Alone with a succession plan in his private study, Charles faced a deeply personal, haunting question. Should a reigning monarch defend the rigid traditions he inherited at all costs, or allow his direct heir to reshape them before time and circumstance force the decision upon them both? Charles studied two very different versions of the proposal in absolute silence. The first version followed the old traditional model, keeping George strictly at the absolute center while leaving Charlotte with a much looser, undefined public role that could easily lead to media exploitation. The second version was William's heavily revised framework, a formal, binding plan defining exactly how the next generation would share structural duty, advanced training, and public responsibility. The king understood perfectly why the difference mattered so much for the family's future. Royal siblings who grew up without a clear, respected institutional purpose had historically been pushed into deep rivalry, toxic resentment, or public confusion. William entered the study, knowing his father would see far more than mere constitutional language on the pages. The prince knew the plan touched older, painful family wounds, especially the tragic distance and estrangement between himself and Harry. Charles feared deep down that official approval would look like a public admission that the family had failed in the past. He also feared that rejecting it would repeat the exact same historic mistake with George and Charlotte, driving a wedge between the siblings. William chose his words with extreme care. He told the king that avoiding the past did not protect the next generation from repeating it. His tone remained deeply respectful, but Charles heard something entirely new and powerful beneath his son's voice. This was not a prince asking for fatherly permission. This was a future sovereign clearly defining the exact monarchy he expected to inherit and rule. Charles looked again at the specific clause naming Charlotte as George's formal constitutional support. Then, he disclosed a deeply private memory from a documented conversation with Queen Elizabeth many years earlier. She had explicitly warned that future royal daughters should never be treated as secondary or lesser simply because ancient tradition had failed to imagine a larger, more dynamic role for them in the modern world. The room fell into a heavy, thoughtful silence. Charles finally approved the complex constitutional language, meaning the official, legally binding wording that gave Charlotte a permanently recognized place within the future royal structure. But the king added one strict, non-negotiable condition. Her education, normal childhood, and personal freedom had to remain absolutely protected until she reached full adulthood. William agreed to the condition immediately, without hesitation. The title was meant to prepare her for future duty, not trap her inside a golden cage. William left the study with a historic decision settled, but Charles remained behind alone. The king slowly removed his glasses, touched the final page of the document with one finger, and quietly whispered Elizabeth's name into the quiet room. 3 full generations of the monarchy had met inside that single signature. The visionary queen who had warned them, the current monarch forced to choose between past and future, and the determined heir absolute who was resolved to change what came next for his children. Then Charles finally signed it, sealing the fate of the crown. The king's signature settled the question of official authority once and for all, yet the very moment the palace began rearranging actual duties, the human cost of Charlotte's sudden promotion became painfully visible. Before the announcement ever reached the public, Charlotte's new title was already rapidly changing rooms, daily schedules, and personal relationships. Advisors feverishly rewrote future ceremony plans, security officials vastly expanded her protection arrangements, and senior royals learned that certain major responsibilities they had expected to retain for life would eventually transfer to the next generation. Yet the most revealing and heartbreaking reaction came not from a courtier or a constitutional expert. It came directly from Charlotte herself when she discovered that one simple, beloved family tradition had already been permanently altered because of the grand title she had never requested or wanted. Charlotte received a massive, new long-term training schedule covering constitutional history, global diplomacy, charitable leadership, and specific duties connected directly to George. Constitutional training meant learning exactly how the inner workings of the monarchy operated, how official state decisions are handled behind the scenes, and how a royal effectively supports the weight of the crown during difficult national moments. Future state occasions were also significantly adjusted, so she would stand closer to her brother, showing absolute unity without suggesting any form of direct competition for the throne. Then the first real personal cost arrived. Charlotte learned that her very next private school event would include extra undercover protection officers. She would no longer be able to enter the school gates in the same quiet, ordinary way as her friends, and her familiar daily routines would now be strictly controlled by security protocols. The news struck her harder than any formal palace briefing ever could. She closed her bedroom door tightly, trying desperately to hold back her growing frustration, but opened it again almost immediately when she heard Catherine gently calling her name from the corridor. Catherine found her daughter alone, lifting the official briefing card from the desk as though she wanted to make it disappear from reality completely. Charlotte looked up and asked whether the grand title meant everything ordinary in her life had to vanish forever. The princess did not answer from across the room. She walked over, sat directly beside her daughter on the floor, and told her that duty must always fit around her humanity, not erase it. William heard what had happened and acted at once to protect his daughter. The prince strictly ordered security officials to reduce the visible changes wherever humanly possible. He had approved Charlotte's institutional position, but he absolutely refused to let the heavy palace machinery turn a family decision into a complete loss of her personal freedom. That distinction mattered immensely because the title was meant to give his daughter a great purpose, not make her feel hunted and watched every hour of her life. Princess Anne supported the plan during a private conversation with William later that day, but her warning was characteristically blunt. The Princess Royal told him that Charlotte must learn how to refuse public attention just as firmly as she learned to accept heavy responsibility. Service without boundaries and said wisely could easily become another form of captivity. William carried those heavy words with him for the rest of the day. He canceled one official meeting, set aside the remaining paperwork, and decided that the next vital conversation could not be between an heir and a future royal guardian. It had to be between a loving father and his daughter. Barakat Adela Revisi Bab 3. Bab Terakir. Yang Tela Dipadakan Agar Panjangnya Mendekati Target 4.000 Karakter. Dengan Tetap Mempertahankan Format Teks Menggelar Panjang Tanpa Subbagian. Serta Disajikan Dalam Versi Bahasa Inggris dan Terjemahan Bahasa Indonesia yang memenuhi syarat monetisasi YouTube. B. Revisi Narasi Voiceover. BAB 3 plus or minus 4.000 Karakter. Versi Bahasa Inggris. English version. The palace machinery could adjust schedules, but only one private conversation could determine whether Charlotte truly accepted the future William had chosen. That evening, William dismissed the aides, left the succession papers behind, and asked Charlotte to walk with him alone through the quiet gardens. There were no courtiers to shape their words and no official statement waiting to be approved. For the first time, the future king admitted he might have made a decision too large for his daughter. Charlotte listened intently, then asked one sharp question. Will George know he can still ask me for help? William stopped, explaining that the title would not make her responsible for every problem her brother faced. Its purpose was to give her formal recognition and protection if she chose to serve beside him. The role was a path, not a command, and she retained the right to decide how far to follow it. William promised that no royal institution could force her to surrender the personal life she wanted. He feared repeating the old destructive pattern where the heir inherits purpose, while the sibling is left behind in the shadows. He would not allow George and Charlotte to inherit that historic wound. Charlotte spoke with total clarity. She was not frightened of helping George, but she feared people would stop seeing her as a sister and view her only as part of a rigid machine. William offered to delay the public confirmation, but Charlotte refused, asking for one promise instead. George must hear every decision before the palace did. William agreed immediately. You are allowed to change your mind, he said gently. Then I choose to help him, but I want to stay myself, Charlotte answered. The prince embraced his daughter, understanding that her human consent mattered more than his signature. Before returning inside, he folded the official briefing away, leaving protocol behind. The palace announcement traveled across the country within minutes, but one spontaneous moment outside Buckingham Palace gave the story its true emotional power. A young girl in the crowd lifted a handmade sign, "A sister can be strong too." By evening, that image became the defining symbol of the monarchy William was building. Broadcasters explained that Charlotte's position would support the future sovereign while leaving George's place as heir completely unchanged. It gave her a formal duty beside him, not a claim against him, preventing rivalry before it could start. While some commentators praised the bold answer to generations of sibling tension, others questioned if Charlotte was too young for such pressure. Catherine watched the debate, then switched off the television, telling her daughter that public opinion could explain a role but never define the person carrying it. Later, a newspaper published a photograph of the siblings side by side with the headline, "The Heir and His Guardian." George pointed out with a smile that the text placed her behind him, even though they walked level. Charlotte laughed, "Newspapers don't decide where I stand." The final verdict belonged solely to the two children. In the end, the title did not change who would wear the crown. It changed how it would be carried. George was no longer prepared for a future of isolation, and Charlotte was not a rival in the shadows. William's plan gave them separate identities and shared trust. Afterward, William gathered the family for a quiet meal without advisors. Charles spoke with deep softness, noting that titles only mattered when they described honest service. George then gave Charlotte a small family keepsake, a reminder that she was his sister before anyone called her his guardian. Charlotte placed it beside her title card, promising that nothing written by the palace could change her bond with him. William had ended the old cycle of pain and confusion. The monarch gave his full blessing, permanently incorporating the role. As George and Charlotte sat side by side, the final verdict became unmistakable. The next crown would not be carried by one child alone, but by a family that had finally learned how to stand together.